Good evening, Zambia. This is Season 1, Episode 5 of the DBM Chat Hour podcast, which comes to you every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Central African Time. Tonight, we will be tackling the question, how do I realign my identity? Understanding Spiritual Identity, Part 1. Welcome to the 5th of the 21 sessions of the DBM podcast series on identity, mandate, and purpose. If you are joining us for the first time, my name is Blessed and I am your host. Last week, we began to explore the question, how do I realign my identity? Understanding Physical Identity, Part 2. We will continue with today's session by briefly revisiting our conclusion on understanding physical identity. We established that personality characteristics which are based on thinking, feeling, and behavior, which we shall refer to as our personality constructive process, can somewhat be altered for the purpose of realigning identity. We also concluded that, as much as behavior can be altered, one's primary personality cannot be changed. We considered also that the broad personality types of an individual, which is either A, B, C, or D personality type, is what we shall refer to as primary personality, and the personality subtypes based on the 16 personalities are informed by peculiar behavior, which on the other hand can be altered. We also emphasized on the alteration other than the changing of behavior, because behavior is to a large extent inherent. During today's session, we shall see why behavior is to a large extent inherent and can sometimes be inherited. Today, we shall explore how inherent behavior is embedded within our spirit being. William R. Clark and Michael Grunstein, in their 2004 publication, Are We Hardwired? A Role of Genes in Human Behavior, state that, open quote, guided by different genetic makeups, we respond to our environment in different ways. But these responses and the actions of our genes are in turn modified by the environment itself. Behavior is the result of a balancing act between genes and the environment, between what we inherit and what we learn. To understand ourselves fully, we must understand both. Close quote. This citation both links last week and this week's session, as well as validates my previous recommendation to consider that spiritual and physical identity are mutually related. Based on this, we shall explore today the foundational nature of spiritual identity and how it links to physical identity. To bridge our session, we shall again refer to Mukuka's question on the possibility of changing one's personality in adulthood. This will help us to begin to understand spiritual identity. Like we concluded in the previous session, one's thinking, feeling, and behavior can be altered, but actual personality cannot, because it is embedded within our DNA. Behavior, which is the outcome of thought process and feelings, is in itself a physical manifestation, whereas the originating thought process itself can be considered to be non-physical or spiritual. We therefore see that it is the spiritual which is the basis of the physical. This is why the spiritual aspect of personality cannot be altered, and as such, spiritual identity cannot be considered in isolation from physical identity. The spiritual component of identity then becomes the basis of mandate and purpose, that for which an individual was created. If this was predetermined, it should not be something that we can simply change by choice. With reference to Tebby's question during episode 1, when she asked about whether one's purpose can be derailed or not, and we responded that it was possible. The reason why it is possible to have purpose derailed is because despite our path of identity and purpose being predeterminable and charted out, man has been given free will and for this reason can choose a path that does not lead him to his purpose. To alter behavior is simple, but to alter personality can be detrimental and have long-lasting effects. This is because the personality of an individual has been designed specifically for that individual to fulfill a specific corresponding life purpose. In attempting to understand spiritual identity, we shall begin by laying a foundation regarding the significance of both physical and spiritual identity, as well as their mutuality. As earlier mentioned, we cannot detach spiritual from physical because what is physical comes from that which is spiritual. We see this too from the very foundation of creation, where God created the world from a mere word which is invisible. If we understand that everything physical has a spiritual link, it will be easier for us to understand that our physical identity is linked to our spiritual identity. For this reason, understanding physical identity is extremely important, without which we cannot comprehend spiritual identity. Laying the foundation of the significance of spiritual identity in relation to physical identity will help us to begin to understand their mutual importance. One can but should not operate in physical identity in isolation from spiritual identity, and vice versa. This is because the physical identity teaches us about the spiritual identity. Let us consider, for the purpose of being practical, that we have now realized our physical identity, which we have already explored during the previous sessions. We would now need to interpret our spiritual identity from the physical identity we have realized. We shall look more closely into this process during next week's session, when we shall explore Understanding Spiritual Identity Part 2. For now, however, we shall look at spiritual identity as the foundation of our very identity, and that it determines our physical identity. Like I said earlier, we looked initially at physical identity prior to exploring spiritual identity, because the physical is visible and easily relatable. Only when we have realized the physical identity can we begin to explore our spiritual identity. Once we have established this, we can now begin to look at the various elements that the spiritual identity is comprised of. The interrelationship between physical identity and spiritual identity, and how it all starts with spiritual identity, whereas it is the physical that is visible and instantly relatable. For this reason, we encounter the physical first, which gives us insight of the spiritual, and the spiritual, in turn, determines the outcome of the physical identity. It will help us to better comprehend this process if we understand this relationship between physical and spiritual identity, and that it is not linear but cyclical. Before we go into isolating the various components of spiritual identity, allow me to give an example in order to illustrate the connection between physical identity and spiritual identity, using the analogy of how the physical relates to the spiritual. Everything that is physical and tangible has a corresponding spiritual and intangible side. Let us take this simple example. Subject A desires to build a house. The first thing that will come into formation will be an intangible and invisible idea, which is a thought. We will refer to this thought as representing the spiritual aspect of Subject A's desire. Subject A will fathom the desire in their mind, which will also represent the thinking aspect. Remember our personality constructive process: to think, to feel, and to behave. Secondly, Subject A will conceptualize the diagrammatic plan of the house on paper or using software. In order for the conceptualized idea to be experienced by an audience, that audience must be sensitive to the stimulus. This will represent the feeling aspect of the constructive process. Thirdly, this house plan or design will be actualized through the construction of that house, informed by the conceptualized drawing. This will represent the behavior or action component of the constructive process. We, in this example, have shown how this process progresses from intangibility to tangibility, or from the spiritual to the physical. If, for instance, the house that is constructed consists of a ramp alongside each staircase, this physical aspect immediately gives us an indication that the house was designed and therefore purposed to accommodate disabled persons using wheelchairs. In the same way, our physical identity gives us an indication of our spiritual identity, which is foundational. If we consider that the existence of a tangible, visible brick-and-mortar house is determined by the intangible, invisible concept of the house, it will be easier for us to understand how our physical identity is informed by our spiritual identity. This example was for purposes of simply illustrating the transformation from invisible to visible. However, when we look at an individual's identity, the transformation is more metaphoric than literal. We shall look a little closer at and give an example of this metaphoric translation using known characters during part 2 of understanding spiritual identity. Some of the metaphors that we will be looking at during next week's session are those that are commonly known to us and seen in the Bible. These will include metaphors such as the use of the word seed, referring to a believer of Jesus Christ, whom we will be referring to as Yeshua. Another one could be the use of the word lion, which would refer to a king. For now, however, let us refocus on understanding the theory of spiritual identity and its significance. Let us return to the identification of the components of spiritual identity. Firstly, we must understand that spiritual identity is invisible to the naked eye, therefore has a characteristic of invisibility. Secondly, spiritual identity determines physical identity. It is therefore a determinant. Thirdly, spiritual identity defines the very function of an individual and relates to one's purpose. Therefore, it is purpose-driven. Fourthly, spiritual identity is superior to physical identity because it both informs as well as transfigures physical identity. This transfiguration being to transform into something more beautiful or elevated. Fifthly, spiritual identity can sometimes be reflected in one's given name. Like Abraham, which literally means father of many. Therefore, it is name-related. Lastly, but not the least, spiritual identity can be realized from understanding the spiritual aspect of an individual's personality characteristics. It is therefore spiritually informed. In summary, the components of spiritual identity are invisibility, determinability, purpose-driven, informative, and transfigurative, name-related and spiritually informed. There are, however, several other aspects of spiritual identity that we will not delve into during this session. These aspects contribute to the realization of spiritual identity and include the birth elements of fire, water, air, and earth, the birth chart components such as zodiac signs, which we shall refer to as Mazzaroth signs, which is Hebrew for zodiac, the triad, the star constellations, and the positioning of the sun and the moon at one's birth. Alternatively, we shall take a route that is simpler and easier to understand for us to determine spiritual identity. Please note that there is an even simpler way to determine spiritual identity, which is by spiritual revelation. However, revelation also requires wisdom, knowledge, and understanding for it to be interpreted. However, in the event that we have not been given that revelation, we could proceed to consider the attributes we have just listed of invisibility, determinability, purpose-driven, informative, and transfigurative, name-related, and spiritually informed. Even then, we also require a spiritual revelation for conviction. This is because spiritual things are spiritually discerned. To be able to use the listed attributes, each one requires that we have all or some of the related information with regards ourselves. We shall begin with the attribute of invisibility of spiritual identity. That which is invisible with a spiritual connotation. This could be a noun, of which a noun can refer to a person, a place, an event, a thing, substance, or quality. Because a noun is often described as a naming word, this noun could name someone generally or specifically. Let us use the example of subject A again and attempt to qualify subject A's spiritual identity. Remember that subject A's physical identity word was preserver. To ascertain the spiritual equivalent of preserve, we could start by looking at some of the word's synonyms and related words. These could include to sustain, to maintain, to keep alive, to conserve, to perpetuate, and so on. Among these words, the one that is closest to a spiritual word is to keep alive. We shall settle then for the word alive as the invisibility of subject A's spiritual identity, and the invisibility noun related to subject A is therefore life or light. We shall move on to the attribute of determinability. As we mentioned, spiritual identity determines physical identity. From what we have learned so far about subject A, we could consider that light determines the aspect of preservation of life. Therefore, the determinability becomes the preservation of life. When we look at the attribute of purpose-driven, we see that this is qualified by the determinability and that the light of determinability has the attribute of purpose-driven and its purpose is to preserve. When we look at the attribute of informative, we will note that the spiritual connotation of light informs the physical connotation of preservation. The transfigurative aspect of Subject A's spiritual identity is that the physical identity of preservation transfigures into the spiritual identity of light. For the attribute of name related, Subject A's given name, which is fictitious, could be Nora or Lucy. Both names mean light and correspond with the subject's spiritual identity. The final attribute, which is spiritually informed, could be that the invisibility of Subject A's spiritual identity is light, which, as we have seen above, is spiritually informed. The most important thing we must know about spiritual identity, apart from the fact that it determines physical identity, is that it cannot be altered, unlike personality characteristics which inform personality and in turn contribute to physical identity, as we saw last week. Spiritual identity is not only an identity blueprint, but it also informs the formation of character and personality. Much as it is easier to realize physical identity prior to realizing spiritual identity, understanding spiritual identity gives us a more conclusive interpretation of our holistic identity, as spiritual identity is directly linked to one's mandate, unlike physical identity, which is only linked to mandate through spiritual identity. We have now established that Subject A's physical identity is preserver and her spiritual identity is life. In summary, this is what the roadmap of mapping someone's spiritual identity would look like. Physical identity, preserver, spiritual identity attributes, alive, life, identity-related name, and transfiguration to light. This individual spiritual identity could therefore be light, as it is the outcome of the collective spiritual attributes. Next week, we shall explore spiritual identity a little further by using some or one more practical example of a universally familiar character that hopefully most of us will be able to identify with. We shall also use the answers to some of your questions to bridge us to the Understanding Spiritual Identity Part 2 session as well. We shall also look at a brief recap from today's session. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like and share with your other social media platforms. Please leave your comments also and share your thoughts on how you found the session's delivery and content. If you would like to know more about how you can embark on this life-changing journey at a practical and on a personal one-to-one level, please visit our LinkedIn page to get more details on our DBM Life or Professional Mentorship Program. When you refer 10 people to this channel through our Facebook page, you will receive a promo code for a discounted mentorship program rate. Follow us on Facebook to learn how to become eligible for a promo code. Thank you for listening, thank you for liking, thank you for sharing, and thank you for subscribing. Join us again next week at the same time as we conclude our session on Spiritual Identity Part 2. DBM is your pleasure and our business.